Good afternoon and welcome to the first of this semester's events for the Yale Program in the History of the Book, a collaboration of the Yale University English Department and the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I'm Catherine James, one of the program's conveners and the curator for early modern books and manuscripts at the Beinecke. And my co-organizers are David Kasten, the George M. Bodman Professor of English in the English department, Ben Card, a third-year graduate student in English, and Colton Valentine, a second-year graduate student in English as well. This year's book history program focuses on the Presence Project, which invites 6 scholars to think about the meanings of presence in relation to the material text. What does it mean to be present in the archive, to be present with the material text, to survive or bear witness? These questions have always been at the core of the humanities as a scholarly and critical project. And the Presence Project represents an invitation to consider them again, now, in our current historical and political context. Our participants will each write an essay to be published in a chapbook and create a process archive of that essay to be housed in the Beinecke Library collections, a kind of time capsule to a future reader of each of their thoughts on the present moment. Next Wednesday, we'll meet with 2 of the project participants, Tia Blassingame and Jesse Meyer, and I hope you'll join us for that discussion. And today, I'm delighted to be present, however virtually, with Bonnie Mack and the 3 representatives of the 39-Step Press, Dennis Duncan, Gill Partington, and Adam Smyth. So let me offer a brief introduction of our speakers before we turn to discussion with them. Bonnie Mack is a medievalist and associate professor at the University of Illinois with appointments in the School of Information Sciences, History, and Medieval Studies. Her work, as many of you will already know, casts an incisive eye on the containers of information, the page, the digitization, the box, and how these make visible the practices and expectations that we bring to them. Some of the titles of her work are How the Page Matters, Archaeology of a Digitization, Research Box, and I've read and listened to Bonnie for years now and have followed her as she's moved from the page to its simulacrum, to the wooden box, and out through the materiality of the text container into the world beyond. 39-Step Press is represented here by Dennis Duncan, Gill Partington, and Adam Smyth. The press itself is, as they say, a wrought iron Model 4 letterpress printer, which I must say is totally inscrutable to me. So I have questions on that in the long term. They acquired this in 2015, and it has been the site of their experimentation with print as a contingent instantiation, one way, among others, of thinking about our relationships with and through the textual object. 39-Step Press marks a commitment to creative and critical interchange, to thinking and working together, that is also visible in their publications themselves. Dennis Duncan's forthcoming index, A History Of, is out this September. It follows his work with Adam Smyth, entitled Book Parts. Gill Partington and Adam together edited Book Destruction, From the Medieval to the Contemporary. And Gill, Adam, and Simon Morris have this year started the literary journal Inscription, the first issue of which appeared this summer. So I'm delighted to be here with such a brilliant gathering. We'll start with a series of 3 questions and then open the discussion to the panel and the audience. And if you have questions, I hope you'll place these in the chat so that we can engage them with them in discussion at the end. And so to begin with, I'll turn with the first question to Bonnie and Gill, and just start off by asking what has guided, if you could just talk a bit about what has guided your thinking as you've approached this year of thinking about your essay and archive for the project.
Okay.
And Bonnie, could you start?
Sorry, it occurred to me that we hadn't quite worked out the logistics. So I'll just say a few words and then pass the microphone over. So first, I'd actually like to begin by thanking you, Catherine, David Scott Kasten, and the graduate students who helped organize this very interesting and imaginative event. It is, in my view, an opportunity that challenges us to rethink what scholarship is, or at least what we think is important about it, given the current constraints that we're all working under. And I think what you've created for us is not only a venue to exercise different modes of knowledge production, but also a plan for the collection and preservation and dissemination of our work afterwards, which I think is a really important phase that is frequently overlooked in conversations about scholarship in the academy, namely, who's going to take it, how are they going to represent it, how is it going to be shared, and anyway, thank you for this amazing opportunity. So turning to the prompt more specifically, so there was a long phase of what I will call flailing for me in terms of trying to figure out what it was that resonated. And I just had to keep coming back to the fact that something resonated, which is why I accepted this, the invitation. So how does your prompt connect to the other kinds of things I've been thinking about? And so I just sort of had to remind myself what the reason was, that, how it piqued my interest and so on. And so as I read and reread the prompt, it emerged to me that my reading of the prompt, at least, was sort of to rethink or think again about textual transmission. So this tradition of textual transmission that I have, studied for many years. So not only, how texts are copied or how ideas are communicated through time, but also the archival presence of the production of the text, which, Catherine, you've sort of framed in terms of the archival sort of appendage to our chapbook. So not only, the text or the idea, but what is the archive, what is the labor, and how do you make that labor visible in the archive? So that's sort of how I began, after the flailing part, how I began to think about this project. So really it's about, for me, the communication and preservation of ideas in libraries and archives. And again, pointing to that sort of very important institutional kind of repository at the end. Where is it going to go? Who is going to keep it? And how are they going to describe it and present it and share it with the world? This obviously raises questions about who gets collected and what gets collected, what is it for? And ultimately then, what gets collected has a relationship to what we call scholarship in the academy, at least. Just as a example, right? The Beinecke doesn't collect swimming pools, so right, that's not going to count in that way, but maybe it would collect photographs of swimming pools or something. So there are certainly certain constraints that these institutions are working with, and I think those are important to look at too. So my interest as a historian is not to do away with these institutions and these practices, right? So not to burn down the Beinecke and say, you must collect swimming pools. No, that's not my interest, but it's to come to a deeper understanding of the institutions, of the practices, of scholarly practices, so that we can discern how the present moment came to be, first of all, i.e. why doesn't the Beinecke collect swimming pools? And yes, should we wish to revise or change course? So just briefly before I turn things over, so most recently I've been thinking again about philology, textual criticism, bibliography, that is the study of manuscript sources as they get copied and transmitting text and ideas from antiquity through the Middle Ages and so on to the present day. There are, this to me is how ideas and text have been made present in the library, right? Through these manuscript sources. We look at what text remains and we try to create an edition out of what remains. So the text is made present in that way. But what I'm also interested in are the absences that are made present by that activity. And so what I'm trying to get at, I think, are the entire spectrum between presence and absence of text. So it's not simply, is the text there or not, but that there are these intervening stages or intermediary stages, the penumbra, that presence can gesture at absence is what I'm getting at. Anyway, so apparently I had more to say than I thought.
Jill, do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Stop me if I have too much, Catherine, if I'm going over time. So the question, what has guided your thinking as you've approached your essay and archive? So I think our short answer is nothing, in the sense that instead of an overall guiding principle, we've been led, if anything, by a mixture of accident and contingency, which are things that we're interested in. We've also been led by materiality, which is also something we're collectively interested in. And when I say materiality, I'm talking about these things: scissors and glue, and this Charles Dickens' The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the Wordsworth, the Oxford World's Classic Edition, and this, an index card box. And I'm going to explain in a moment how all of those things come into play and what our project is. But first of all, a word about presence, which is the theme of this Yale Book History seminar series. And both our project and the process of arriving at it have kind of circled this theme of presence, but again, not in a way that we've anticipated or planned, but often obliquely through its inverse, since we've been confronted by a series of absences. So we embarked on the project in the midst of the second UK-wide lockdown. So immediately we were forced to consider how we would do it in the absence of one another, remotely through Zoom or through the postal service. But also we'd be working in the absence of our printing press, which is at Adam's house. So we wouldn't collectively have access to this. But since we've always had to work with the limitations of our technical abilities, and also with the kind of glitches, the limitations and flaws of the press itself, in a way, this was a kind of another maneuver, another sidestep, another way to think about the affordances of our equipment or lack thereof. So our initial decision was to kind of think around this and to set something in motion by choosing a book or a set of books that we could make an intervention into. And we weren't necessarily thinking about a destination at this point. So we would begin by erasing, by collaging, and by cutting up. And the process of choosing a book to start with was, again, a bit haphazard, in that we threw around a few possibilities and went for a suggestion of Adam's in the end, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which is Charles Dickens' last unfinished novel. Now, none of us are Dickens scholars. None of us had even previously read the book, but this has turned out to be a serendipitous choice, in that Edwin Drood is incomplete, but also, because of this, very generative. And it's this principle, this space where the ending should be, that has come to be maybe the guiding force of the project. It's guided us down a few blind alleys initially, and there were some false starts in that we deliberated whether we should each begin with a different edition or the same edition, whether we should have 3 different but related books, a biography, for example, or a critical work alongside the novel. But the more practical issue was how we would collaborate, and posting entire books to one another seemed like a slow and cumbersome way to proceed. And it was when we got an email from Catherine that we decided on an alternative shape for the project. She gave us a list of storage boxes asking us to choose the size that would best fit our project. But at this point, we inverted this logic, and like maybe also thinking like Bonnie about containers, how containers shape knowledge. So we allowed the container to dictate the form rather than vice versa. And we thought, what if we began with an index card box, and the project involved filling this, so that instead of intervening in Dickens' novel, we'd be disassembling it and reassembling it in new ways and in a new format as a kind of index of Drude. Adam's going to say more about index cards and why they're interesting, but I just want to talk briefly about this particular novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and why that has kind of how that has steered us. It was serialized, for those who don't know much about Dickens, like most of his novels, published in monthly parts from April to September in 1870. It was intended to be 12 parts, but only six of these were actually finished when Dickens died in June. He left only fragmentary notes indicating how the remainder of the novel might unfold, and a lot of unanswered questions. Who is the mysterious Datchery, and why has he appeared in the cathedral town of Cloisterham? What is the strange inscription in the cathedral crypt? Most of all, though, why has the eponymous Drude suddenly disappeared? Has he been murdered by his fiery nemesis Neville Landless, or by his opium-smoking and sinister uncle John Jasper? Is he still alive? We'll never know, and that's the point. It's Dickens' shortest novel because it's unfinished, but it's also the one that's had the most varied and febrile and frankly weird afterlife in terms of the literature and the speculation that surround it. There have been all kinds of attempts to complete it. I've been working with and cutting up this, which is the decoding of Edwin Drude by Charles Forsyth, published not as literary criticism, but in the Gollanc's detective fiction series. And there've been a whole string of these Drude completions, ranging from those that attempted to be as faithful as possible to those that spoofed or reinvented the novel, those that played fast and loose with the characters and even invented new ones. So in the 1870s, Orpheus C. Kerr transposed the novel to the American South. Someone called Gillian Vars expanded it far beyond Dickens' own intentions into a mammoth 1,000-page triple-decker. And most weird of all, Thomas Powers James published a completion which was supposedly dictated by Dickens himself from beyond the grave. So there have also been lots of non-fiction works that attempt to find the solution to the mystery by piecing together its clues as if it were a real crime. Sherlock Holmes has been drafted in more than once to solve it. And there have been factional disputes between the undertakers, those who think Drude is dead, and the resurrectionists who think he's alive. There are those who think the whole thing is a coded reference to the Indian Thuggee worshippers of the goddess Kali, and those who think Dickens didn't write it at all, but it was Wilkie Collins. So we found that we'd not only chosen a source text, but stumbled into the bizarre world of Drudism, a place full of obsessives, amateur criminologists, conspiracy theorists, and spirit mediums. So there's something brilliantly excessive about the mystery of Edwin Drude. Not only does it seem to exceed any single text or critical corpus, but it even exceeds the boundaries of literary critical discourse itself, spilling over into more outre and vulgar territory of true crime, whodunit, seances, zombie fan fiction, and pastiche. There have been film and TV adaptations of Drude, but there's also been a mock trial presided over by G.K. Chesterton in 1914. There's been a musical at which the audience could vote on who the guilty party was. There's been a recent BBC radio adaptation which provided an ending solving the mystery by revealing that several of the major characters were gay. So maybe the index card box is the only appropriate form here that's expandable enough to encompass this strange Drudian universe. But what would an attempt to index the mystery of Edwin Drude mean in practical terms? What would it look like? What lines of inquiry could you follow? These are the things we are thinking about in our project. It's a book whose ending is always tantalizingly absent, and a gap that people have attempted to fill by providing a kind of elusive presence. Our project enters into this spirit of Drudism, and it plays with this kind of tantalizing but impossible idea of a total archive of Drude, one which would say everything, exhausting all the book's possibilities. Okay.
That's wonderful. And I think the spirit, Bonnie, I think your philologists could meet the spirit of Drudism in a sort of wonderful light. So that brings us on to our second question. And I wanted to ask Adam and Bonnie to to respond to the question of how you go about, how you begin a project like this, how you begin to think about it, how you begin to work on it. And then that stage that I think so many of us really, that all of us encounter of moving from your early ideas into actually like structuring a final, like to coming to a final structure on it. And so I wonder, Adam, can you start with that or?
Sure, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. So how do we begin and then how do we move to the final structure? And Gill's given some ideas about this already, but I guess the broad outline, I guess, the broad kind of model for how we got to where we are now was that we had an initial idea, which was quite like what we'd done before. And then a contingency intruded, an interruption, and then which produced the project in its current form. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about the early lost years of this project, the bit that went wrong, and then get to where we are at the moment. And we began, I guess, with an awareness of the constraints we were facing, and we were interested in those, and we wanted to respond to those. And obviously that meant primarily our physical separation, the fact that we weren't in the same place, and not only that, but all our work previously had been completely communal in spirit and social, and even a bit blurry in terms of the edges of when we were working and when we were eating or playing music or doing childcare, all these other surrounding kind of activities. So we were confronted with a very different environment in which to work, and that was kind of baffling but also interesting. So we wanted to think about how to deal with the fact that we were all in different places. And Gill's talked about the press itself as this massively immobile thing, this heavy hulk that was going nowhere. So our first idea was we quickly realized that we wanted to put texts in the post, in the mail, and circulate them between us. And that seemed like a really interesting idea. And we all had our different reasons for that. I mean, I work generally on the early modern period and have been interested for a long time in bits of texts and poems that move between readers and move across sites of publication, how they alter as that make that journey. So text in motion, text moving around appealed to us. We liked the idea of the text moving around when we couldn't move around, I guess. That was appealing. And we liked the idea of the text or the book or the thing that we were going to put in the post as a kind of proxy for presence, like a visiting card or a letter in a Shakespeare play that kind of announces someone who isn't there. And also, I think, although I don't know quite how far we've articulated it thus far, I was thinking today, I think we quite like the idea that like the temporal lag built into using the mail as a transmission mechanism. That's quite appealing, I think. And consequently, the way our collaboration would become articulated in the sense of, being distinctly jointed into bits and slowed down in ways that were interesting, I think. So we want so text in the post, text moving around, that was appealing. And our initial idea, as Gill has hinted at, was to do with book modification. We had an idea that if we have a novel and then a biography of the author and then a literary critical work based on that novel, and kind of launch these in motion between us. And every time one lands at our house, we remove a little bit, we snip a little bit out, and then we graft it onto the other text. So there's a gradual movement of bits of one text onto the other. And we like the idea of that in constant material form of the book that produces. And I think we thought that might be a fun way to think about the relationship between the aesthetic object, the novel itself, and a biographical discourse about that novel, and the literary critical discourse, and how the books as they merged into each other might produce that. And we still might come back to that. I don't think it's completely abandoned. But the contingency, the intrusion was the deus ex machina of Catherine's email, which said, would you like some conservation resources to think about, some boxes and folders? And we were introduced to these very appealing websites with special paper and conservation materials. And we thought, although this was Gill's good observation, that we should turn this from being an administrative task to being part of the creative process. And how about we think about conservation and storage, before we've produced the work rather than a belated kind of thing that happens afterwards. If we start with storage and conservation and then get round to producing something, that seemed interesting. And that's how we began to think about index boxes, index card catalogues, and how we realized that the thing to circulate is not whole texts, which were kind of too present perhaps, as well as being too bulky, but index cards relating to those books. So just to put it in, I'm going to show you a few index cards that we produced, but just to try and be clear about what it is we're actually doing, which I guess is the question, is that we would all read Dickens's Drude, Edwin Drude, as Gill said, his final unfinished 1870 novel. We would read it, and then we would read, watch, listen to other stuff about Drude and Dickens and the period and any kind of connection at all. And all the time we would individually compile index cards. So we would read, and rather like we were kind of pre-1997 academics, I guess, that's probably when index cards shifted away, isn't it? We would start making notes on our index cards. And that might be handwritten notes, or that might be cut out bits that we'd glue in, or it might be more creative responses. And then once a week at a minimum, but sometimes more, we would post those on. So I'd do 8 or 9, I'd post them to Gill. Gill would receive them, and then she would use those as prompts for her own indexing, and there'd be the continual cycling around of index cards. And we wanted, I think, and we want the cards to be mostly in transit. In other words, for most of their life, these cards are in the post rather than on our desks. That's interesting. So we'd receive cards, we'd augment them, and we'd relaunch them. And in the end, although I guess there never will be an end, there'll be a pause or a drawing to a pause, we'll have a big index card box with hundreds and hundreds, I guess, thousands maybe, we'll see, of index cards all feeding off or buzzing around Edwin Drude, the novel, in some way. And what we will have produced, I think Dennis might talk about this in a moment, is a kind of machine for thinking about Drude, which has ceased to be us and has become another thing. Let me just show you a couple of slides of the kind of thing that that I'm talking about. So I'm going to screen share. Why is that not coming up? Give me a sec. Just chat amongst yourselves. There we go. Can you see a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Great. So here are a few, just a sample of the kind of thing we're talking about. Some of the cards are, I guess, exactly what you might expect, maybe thematic, or maybe noticing a refrain in the book, the missing parents that are everywhere in Drude, for example. And I made this heading and made a couple of notes, and then posted this off to Dennis. Stuff about surfaces in contrast to depths. We're all thinking about surfaces, aren't we now, and depth ontologies. There's loads of stuff about shallowness and surface in this book. Drude is constantly thinking about himself as lacking depth, as being a superficial figure. It's his relationship with Rosa being flat, a certain flatness that attends them. So I'd make those notes and then launch those, and they'll be augmented. This is one that started with Gill hands, with snipping out various images of hands that she found in her edition. And this came to me, and then I added in a transcript about another character who makes reference to her hands. This is a map of a particular scene when John Jasper is encountering Rosa near the sundial, which has been mapped out. I'm not quite sure who has that one now. It's somewhere out circulating. This is a list of fruits. I don't know where this is going. Raspberry, gooseberry, apricot, plum, damson, apple, peach. So you have plum buns, chapter 6. Then we got interested in methodology and index cards themselves, kind of moving around all over the place. And so then we started making notes about index cards, about which there's quite a lot of interesting recent work. The index card as a form, and you can see some of my notes there. Other books that I was reading while I was reading Drude, David Pearson, Jessica Pressman, Thomas Hardy, that great trio. this was a synchronic slice of the first broadcast on TV, a broadcast on TV of 1960, which happened at the same time as a story in The Guardian about a horse attacking a woman who gave it apples. And then another theme that started to emerge was notes towards an interactive edition, which I wrote down on a card and produced this little suggestion, and then other cards got produced in the same spirit. Notes towards an interactive edition of Drude. This is some pages of Drude made into origami birds, and this is a kind of Vauvel, which Gill did, in which you can work out and think about the possible endings of the book. So we've got loads and loads of these, but that's just a sample of the range, and I guess some are more conventionally analytical, some are more self-reflexive, some are more creative themselves. Let me, so you can you, is it close the screen share now? Yep, okay, good. So just really the last little note I wanted to add in was that as we've been doing this, I think we've been thinking about the affordances of the index card a little bit, and that's been brought into focus by producing these hundreds of cards and posting them and augmenting them. We've been thinking about the card as a proxy, as something that points back to the book, but that is not itself the book. We've been thinking about the mobility and the lightness of the cards. We've been thinking about the modularity of the index card too, the card as a unit of meaning, and the card collection as it accumulates, growing through the piling up of these discrete modules. And we've been thinking about just how unending this project is, or how unending any index card project is, not bound by the start and end of a notebook or a book, but with no edges. And that was interesting. And the other thing, and this has just been my last little point, is that we have become really acutely aware and kind of viscerally aware, I think, of the fact that we are not fully in control of the process anymore. And that's really interesting. We're not in control of what we're producing. And I mean that, I suppose, in two ways. Firstly, anything I add to a card I receive is partly shaped by the previous record that's been added by Gill or Dennis. In other words, I'm following certain lines that have been launched previously. But I think more fundamentally, we're not fully in control of the process, in the sense that we've started a process that quickly has a life of its own. And the more cards we add, and Dennis might pick up on this, I think, the more connections become possible. And by the permutational logic of the box of cards, the number of connections and the nature of those connections soon exceeded what we could grasp or what we could imagine. And there's a lovely, compelling sense of every time we add in another card and put it in the post, the less control we have over this project, and the more we recede as kind of authors or controlling figures or people fully in charge of what's going on. And that's been a really interesting relationship to absence and presence that I don't think we fully expected. Okay, that's all I want to say for now.
Bonnie, do you want to?
Thanks. So, as in fact my colleagues have foregrounded, where I started actually was with the box. And actually I was pressing poor Catherine. I kept emailing her. I said, what shape is the box? How are things packaged in the box? And I wanted sort of all these details. And then of course we got the amazing websites, and so many different kinds of boxes, weird doll boxes, boxes for toy cars, incredible. So that was me trying to find the parameters, the sort of immovables, the constraints. So you know, I thought about all the different boxes. They have dress boxes, so many anyway. And then you know, always coming back to this notion of presence and absence. And so after I stopped getting distracted by boxes and whether the Beinecke could archive, biological materials or biohazards. Still don't have an answer, actually. And like how long it takes for things to evaporate in that, and maybe they wouldn't want that, actually. Yeah, so I went back to my roots, as it were, and just thought about the scholarship around textual tradition that I know and what I have, because here at the University of Illinois, the library has basically been closed for an entire year. There are some services, but sort of really doing your usual humanistic research is difficult and has been slowed. So, again, thinking about what I have here, what I already know, what can I use or reuse? And this, again, I think it's weird, but the pandemic isn't, has been an interesting experiment in terms of, and maybe this is what I'm doing in this project, is actually looking again at the structures that we have. So look again at the textual editions that we have and look at what is not there. And that doesn't necessarily mean, discovering a new copy of X, but it's actually to look very closely at what is there to see what is not there. Yeah, so the way in which I usually, as if I do all these things all the time, is actually develop sort of the scholarly foundation upon which I then can do my more, Jill will like this, creative work. So get my argument sorted out, figure out what it is that I'm trying to say before sort of moving into the, thinking about what form makes sense, what material form will augment the argument that I'm trying to make. So one previous idea that I had that was sadly jettisoned was, in fact, to create a critical edition of a text, but not actually have the text. So there would be just a lot of apparatus around a missing text that, so it would be, a lot of these very early bibliographers and textual critics would have very elaborate critical editions apparatus that would talk about all the different manuscript sources that they were looking at, how they were reconciling different readings, how sort of this fragment was associated with this fragment. And so my idea was to create this huge, enormous edition, but it would be around a text that would be absent. Then I realized I don't think I could do that in the time remaining. So sadly, I had to set that idea aside. I then sort of thought more again about this textual edition and the way that the presence of a text or a material text, the way that material texts are represented in the library and the archive. And so my preliminary idea is that I might discuss three different ways, three different modes of representation, three different likenesses, if you will. Whether I can do all three, I don't know. But so one is indeed the sort of textual edition, likeness in shall we say, content or intellectual form. So as I mentioned, the idea that the way one might represent and copy a text over and over, thinking about that practice, thinking about what it makes visible, namely a text, the content, the words, but also that if we look at that practice, it also makes certain absences present. So again, if you look at what the philologists were doing, they would look at the material condition of their manuscript sources too. So even though your end result might be a nice printed text, right, in the 21st century or digital one, there was still kind of a reference, if you look for it, to the material manuscripts, and that the material condition of those manuscripts actually influenced what we have now. So what do I mean by that? Fragmentary manuscripts, right? There are, interpolations. There might be loose pages in a manuscript that get stuck in the wrong order, and then subsequently they get copied in that order and over and over and over again. There could be damage to a manuscript, and then the scribe just skips over those words because he can't read them or fills them in. And then that gets copied and copied and copied. And so there are these interesting absences that are present in this textual tradition, again, if we look for them. And, you know, some people have advocated for, you know, a queer philology that seeks other metaphors beyond the genealogical. That seems like a fair thing to do. I've also, in my other work, accidentally, there is sexual and asexual reproduction, and so even within asexual reproduction, there are at least five different ways that things can reproduce asexually. So you know, since it's spring, we all know that you can chop off a bit of a plant and jam it in the ground, and often it'll grow, right? So things like that. So, you know, could we bring in those kinds of metaphors here so that it's not necessarily the notion of patrilineal descent and about, you know, purity of the text and contamination, but more about sort of proliferation or fragmentation and, you know, clones and these kinds of things, because as we know, even clones don't actually produce, or not identical to the original anyway. Right, and then there's also a very interesting, sorry, I just thought of that. There's also a very interesting operation in textual criticism that where you mark a passage as spurious, as questionable, but you actually leave the line in there. So that, I think, was, to me, was a very interesting, compelling example of presence and absence, so that, you know, it's not supposed to be there, but you leave it there. So where is that in the spectrum of presence and absence? Okay, so that's sort of copy one. Remember, I'm trying to go for three. Second is obviously the facsimile. You know, as Catherine knows, I've done some work on this, but I would like to do more. So it's kind of a copy, the figural form, right? So if the first one was like intellectual or content, here it's like the figure, the shape of the books, the codex. And here I'm gonna, so image, right? Digital images, digitizations, normal facsimiles. So I've been looking at some art historians here and thinking about how images, and specifically icons, actually introduce a relation that is absent. So it's always pointing to something that is not there. And so I thought that that might be interesting to borrow from them and discuss the facsimile in that way. Not sure how that's going to work in terms of the archival piece, but I'm thinking about it. The third copy, again, if I get there, is the specimen. So likeness in material form. So a sample, in fact. So the facsimile, of course, is not actually, say, a medieval manuscript, right? It's you know, it was made in the 1986 and printed in Lucerne, Switzerland. It's modern paper, but there might also be a category of specimen likeness. So one thing that I thought of that might be relevant would be the entire sort of rare book and manuscript collections, where we often say, well, we don't have the Lindisfarne Book of Hours, but here's a different kind of Book of Hours. So it's kind of the same thing. And thinking about what that relationship is. So likeness in material form. Not quite sure if the logic works there, but that's sort of what I'm working with at the moment. So a project so far in 3 parts.
That's wonderful, and I know I have questions for afterwards, so I hope people are also remembering to put them in the chat to come back to. So for the third question, with Bonnie and Dennis, I wondered if you could talk about whether you've had a particular future reader in mind as you've been working on this, either for this project in particular, or just, you know, generally, who your sort of future who your future reader might be as you think, and what your relationship is with them. So Bonnie, do you want to start with that? Or great.
So I'm going to refrain from saying this is going to be a short answer because I've made that mistake already. But I don't think I have that much to say, and I'm actually very interested to hear what others feel, especially you know, not only my colleagues here, but also people, some very esteemed colleagues in the audience, I see. So I mean, one always apparently is supposed to have an imagined future reader. This is what I have learned. For example, when you submit a book proposal, there's always a section where you say, who is your market audience? And so you have to say something. But what I recall from my own, the book proposal for How the Page Matters, and then later its reception, right? Like who I thought would read it did not, and there were audiences who read it whom were not necessarily on my radar, but thank you for reading it. So I think after that, not exactly lesson, but after that episode, I thought, well, it seems, in fact, that it's very difficult to predict with whom and with which audiences your work will resonate. So I try no longer to over-determine it, because in fact, if you sort of cater to an audience over here, but in fact it's an audience over here that finds it interesting, you might actually have cut out that audience by sort of facing too much this way. So sort of that's the kind of short answer. But I think more generally then, because I have this kind of idea that, you never know who will read it, is to try to make it accessible across the disciplines, so that, if someone is not familiar with philology, right, and is interested in sort of the digital stuff, that not to say that people interested in digital stuff wouldn't be interested in philology, but that it remains accessible no matter which sort of avenue you come at it from. In terms of this particular project, I think what I want to play with the idea about with the chapbook, Catherine, you and I had this conversation earlier on, is that the chapbook is not actually going to be stored or kept with the archival material. Furthermore, versions of the chapbook will circulate, right? They're going to be mailed out, and they might be sort of on a PDF somewhere. So then what is the relationship between the chapbook and the archival box? And what, in terms of readership, what would make that box and the Beinecke an attractive location for someone to go to, right? So if you basically sort of had all those bits in your chapbook, nobody would come to Beinecke. So what is that relationship? What is sort of, I don't want to say value add, but what is the apparatus doing? How does it shed light, or how does it provide a different reading of the chapbook publication? Anyway, so.
And Dennis, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought this was a great question. I really want to talk about readers. There's a couple of types of reading, I think, that that we're thinking about or kind of working towards here. So I'll take them in turn. First up, it's Edwin Drude's a mystery novel. It's there in the title, The Mystery of Edwin Drude. The Moonstone, Wilkie Collins, that The Moonstone's one of the kind of founding texts of the detective genre, and it's a really obvious precedent. It came out a couple of years before. It was serialized in Dickens's All the Year Round. So mystery, I think, is the intention for the Mystery of Edwin Drood, before the unintended mystery of the novel's kind of curtailment after half of its projected 12 installments. But mystery produces a certain type of, or a certain mode of reading, I think, of what we could call suspicious reading, to take a term from Rita Felsky, and then apply it to a domain where it's not at all an inappropriate mode. I think Felsky is kind of critical of this sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. When it comes to detective novels, when it comes to mystery, that's fine. That's how it's supposed to be. I like the echo here between literary critics and their hermeneutic of suspicion and readers of mystery who are supposed to be suspicious. That's the game that we play with the novelist, or the game that the novelist plays with us. But it's also a kind of credulous suspicion. We have to believe that there is a solution for us to start suspecting what it is when we read a mystery novel. So this is where Edwin Drood is really interesting. You get that presence and absence again. Can readers work themselves up into believing that this is that this incomplete mystery really is a mystery, or the usual type of mystery, one that warrants that type of suspicious reading, a mystery that has a solution, that can bear our attempt to solve it. And I love the way Gill spoke about this earlier. The novels provoke these different out there hermeneutic approaches, the seance, the mock trial, the decoding, all of which reminded me, I'll put it up on the slide, it reminded me of this bit from the Dry Salvages. If I can just share my screen briefly, because you'll see a little bit about what I'm talking about. Other hermeneutics of suspicion, Eliot talks about to haruspicate or scry, observe diseases in signatures, evoke biography from the wrinkles of the palm and the tragedy from fingers, sortilege, tea leaves, riddle the inevitable with playing cards, fiddle with pentagrams, dissect the recurrent image into preconscious terrors, to explore the womb or tomb or dreams. All these are usual pastimes, and drugs, all features of the press. Now, when I was reminded of this passage, I went back to it, and suddenly I'm thinking, oh my God, drugs, that's Jasper, that's Princess Puffer, or that's Ezra Jennings in The Moonstone. Isn't that funny? Isn't that, you start to become sort of suspicious, or to see echoes of things, all features of the press. What are press? 39-step press. Isn't that, so you're, one is starting to become credulous in a way, starting to see things in places where things aren't really there. And I think that's part of the aim of the project, if you like, to see these are all kind of versions of credulity and suspicion at the same time. I guess what we wanted to do is to see how far we can work ourselves up into that state of suspicion where this research, these index cards that we're passing around each other, start to feel meaningful, start to feel like they could lead somewhere. So I was talking to my students about this project, and they drew my attention to this meme. I'm going to share my screen with you again. How do I do this? Share screen. You might have seen this. I hadn't, but I really like it. When I said this to my students, they said, "Oh, there's the meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia," and I kind of love this. It's Charlie Day. This is the type of reading that we're performing, if you like, or simulating. Something that came up when Bonnie gave her first talk in the autumn was the material fetish. That one of the things that's a joy about her cabinet of curiosities is the cabinet itself and all the boxes and the jars. And one of the fun things about looking at this meme is that I notice it produces in me a kind of thrill at the paper and the drawing pins and the bits of red string. This illusion of information, of solving the mystery, is actually being generated by the matter, by the stationery. So that's one of the joys of this project. Catherine sent us the Gaylord Library Supplies catalogue and told us to order anything that we needed. And so we spent a long time, we had a long Zoom late into the night, deciding what size index cards we'd be using, because the material is part of the way that you generate this kind of frisson of meaning, of data producing meaning for this sort of suspicious reading. When we were doing this, when we were talking about index cards, we didn't realize at the time, but inadvertently, it turns out that we were recreating a meeting that happened in the Cooperation Committee of the American Library Association in September 1877, where they voted to standardize the use of two different sizes of index card, the 5 by 12.5 centimeter card and the 9 by 14 card. That's literally what we spent about 2 hours coming up with. So that this is a nice detail from Marcus Krajewski's book about the history of the index card, paper machines. Another nice detail is about the first card catalogue. So I'm going to share it with you now. The catalogue was in the library at Harvard. Unfortunately, the frisson wasn't quite strong enough for it to be in the library at Yale. But here's what Krajewski says. If I can share my screen again. Back to meeting. Oh, hang on. Are you still seeing this?
Yeah.
The arrival of the card catalogue. The final step in the development of the modern card index, unrestricted access to the catalogue for a common readership, occurs in 1861, Ezra Abbott, blah, blah, blah. In fact, it doesn't occur in 1861. It's undertaken about 1862. Sibley, his boss, promotes the hiring of female employees, spurring progress considerably. The number of employees steadily rises, And already in 1862, part of the new catalogue can be made accessible to the general public. Now, I've highlighted the next paragraph. Despite the generally appreciated advantages of the new apparatus, it takes another 8 years till the catalogue is finally complete in 1870. And the whole process comes to its conclusion. The card catalogue finally arrives and the whole process comes to its conclusion in 1870. Oh, that's an important year for us. That's the year that Drude disappears, that Dickens dies, that the novel does and doesn't come to its conclusion. So this is strange and this is suspicious. I read it with what you might call a kind of wild surmise. What does it mean? It feels like we need to stretch a piece of red string between these two things. And of course, this is just what happens when you put two things alongside each other. Their affinities sort of bristle, they kind of suggest new meanings. Really, this is the whole point of doing your research on cards so that you can reorder them. You can see information coming, arising from new configurations of the cards. If we decided to work on Dracula rather than Edwin Drood, we'd have found that the novel is completely, utterly, kind of fundamentally concerned with data organization, with getting the most complete record of information possible, and typing it up and putting it in the right order so that the patterns become visible. It's absolutely, unarguably, a novel about filing. If you put the cards in the right order, meanings emerge. So this is the other type of future reader that I wanted to talk about. I might have mentioned this in our talk in the autumn, but the last slide I'll show you. This is a book from 1960 by Raymond Queneau. It's called the 100,000 milliards de poèmes, 100,000 billion per, I always get it wrong, it's 10 to the power of 14 sonnets. It consists of 10 pages, you can see, each with a sonnet printed on the recto side. Adam has an index card he showed you earlier, just like this, because the page is cut between every line of every poem. And what this means is that you can start with, say, the first line of the sonnet on page 1, and then fold, say, 4 of the second lines over. So the second line you're getting is from page 5, and then maybe we could take the third line from page 10 or whatever. It's like one of those children's books of heads, bodies, and legs. Queneau's job is to write the 10 base sonnets so that however you fold the page, you'd be left with a sonnet that functions as a sonnet. It rhymes, it's syntactically correct. The result is 10 to the power of 14 different poems, that the possibility of 10 to the power of 14 different poems. Queneau says if you read one sonnet a minute, 24/7, it would take you something like 1.7 million years to write all of the poems in the book. Of course, Queneau hasn't written each one of the sonnets. All he's done is he's built the machine, and the book contains far, far more poetry than he can know. The book knows more. The book has much more knowledge about the poems than the author does. And so with our deck of index cards, for the epigraph for the 100,000 milliards de poème, Queneau has this phrase from Alan Turing, a British cyberneticist from the 40s. Turing says, only a machine could appreciate a sonnet written by another machine. So Catherine, when you asked us about future readers, this is what I thought of. When you asked us to think about future readers, this was the second thing that came to mind, the suspicion that we're building a machine that might know more about Edwin Drood than we do, that given time, given an ideal reader, another machine, we might call it Edwin Droid, the index and its mechanical reader might know what we can only suspect. It might turn out that Edwin wasn't murdered at all. He simply vanished. He became immaterial and transubstantiated into an array of textual characteristics, disassembled into his constituent parts at the moment that the card catalogue fired up for the first time. So, does that answer your question?
That's really wonderful, Dennis and Bonnie. And I know we have a couple of questions that have been put into the Q&A, and I please others add your questions to this, but I wanted to start with one question that has come into focus for me in listening to all of you. think about this in this session, and I'm struck by a kind of curious relationship of the personal and the impersonal, and how you've all described this project. And I was thinking, and I'm also struck by by how my email about boxes was read, because I have to say, from my perspective, I wrote that so tentatively, not wanting to structure your thinking on this, in part because one of the strange things about archives is that they're often something that is created by other people after you're no longer an agent in that discussion. That is the sort of what's gathered up from your desk or from your garage or from wherever that is that ends up somewhere that might or might not be a permanent or a repository with aspirations of permanence. And so with that in mind, I wondered how you all were thinking about metadata, basically, how you envisioned the your project being described in a way that would make sense for a future reader, and then also how you imagined those future readers situating you personally, and reading this as a project in this particular period, in the pandemic, in the middle of the social justice protests of the past year, and whether you'd thought about the ways in which you yourselves as authors might be historicized in that. And I'm thinking of John Overholt forward on Twitter last week. I forwarded a Folger blog post that mentioned the Folger's archive of its librarian's handwriting. And this is something that I've hoped to have at the Beinecke, because often from the curatorial perspective, one of the relationships I have with the collections and with what something is or what it means is within the context of institutional history. And that is often the descriptions of catalogers of my past peers, who are known, often identified by their handwriting, more often than by their initials or by their names. And so there's a strange way, Bonnie, coming back to your idea of textual transmission, of philology, there's a way in which the institutional mediation of this is also takes on its own peculiarly personal and yet also impersonal engagement with the description, with defining what something is within the framework of the card catalog, or the structure of the cards, or the database description, or the catalog record versus the archival finding aid, and the different ways that this configures what something is or what it means, and who the reader will be reading it, and in what type of space, and whether, as Bonnie, you point out, whether they'll be taking a book or a chapbook, a codex object, or whether they'll be unpacking a box. And trying to find something within it. And so I just wondered generally, I know this is a big question, but if you had thought about metadata and how you would like to have it described, or how you envision it might be described, this project in the end, and what relationship how that made you see yourselves as authors situated in this moment here. And I guess really, whoever wants to chime in.
That's a really interesting big question. I had one little thought about what you were saying at the end there, and that is that obviously our project, our index card, our circulating, moving cards will end up in this box, which will end up in the Beinecke, and so will be very still as a thing. And I guess it's an interesting thing for us to think about how we describe or maintain or convey the motion and the movement, which is at the heart of what we're doing, I think, and what we're interested in. This idea that text kind of flashing around between the three of us, and as I said, are largely in the post and only momentarily static. And I think maybe we should think more about how we keep that movement alive in the piece, or convey it, or describe it. I mean, one prosaic way we're doing that at the moment is that we're keeping envelopes, and we're keeping marks, and we're keeping stamps, and we're keeping all the kind of paratextual clutter that describes the posting and the moving and the receiving and the opening and the tearing. And I think that wants to be part of the catalogue too. Yeah, that's one thought.
I like it's a sort of question about how you index an index. So how is this kind of this thing itself, which is a sort of weird kind of finding aid, a sort of like non-functional or semi-functional kind of catalogue. How are you going to catalogue that catalogue?
And also, do we expect users to turn to our card catalogue as a helpful way of navigating Drude, or which they may, or not?
Yeah. They'll be sorely disappointed though, won't they? I think one of the things that's been irresistible with this, the metadata within the project, as Gill's saying, if you look at the headwords that we choose, I mean, the headwords are always going to be a kind of subjective issue, but with the headings on each card, how these would be filed, range from sort of sensible hats, hands, interruptions, footnotes, to things that are, you know, essentially just designed to make each other laugh as we send them through the post. That there's still a kind of unavoidable, well, maybe it's avoidable, but we don't really want to avoid it, social aspect to this that there is to the press anyway, of this is semi-flippant, and so the metadata contained within it has, you know, falls along quite a large spectrum of sensible to absurd.
So as someone who works in or near the field of library and information science, I think about descriptive practices a lot. And also I think about the librarians and archivists that I train, that are trained particularly to engage in the practice of creating metadata, creating, you know, descriptive practices. And so I think maybe this was part of the reason that, you know, I really wanted to know what boxes we had. And then at some point I thought, well, maybe it doesn't matter, because as Catherine was saying, to some extent, that is a kind of afterlife that sort of becomes someone else's authorship, as it were. And so in some sense, the metadata and descriptive practices for this project, that to me is authored by the librarian or the accessioning archivist. Certainly there are arguments about, you know, people want to have control about the way they are described or the way that their work is presented. You know, sure, that's a fair argument. But you know, some things that I think about with my students is like, who is the metadata for? What are, you know, for whom are these descriptions? And often the author might not know how to describe their work most appropriately. You've all sort of had those, you know, amazing introductions, and you think, oh, that's actually a really good description of my work. Hadn't thought about it that way. Could you write that down for me? So it often can be sort of the outside observer, right? The librarian, the bibliographer, the archivist, who actually is able to describe the work in a way that is actually more legible for the people coming into the archive and coming into the library. So so I think, you know, so I have sort of, also, I don't want to put my students out of work. So if we all create our own metadata and describe our own work, I'm not sure what my poor students would do. This is sort of related, I think, also to Leah Price's question about index cards. And I guess one thing that I wanted to raise is, in fact, I have recent publication on card catalogs as well. And to think about, Leah was asking about whether we might consider ourselves as theorists of cardboard, and certainly sort of the materiality of cards. So I wanted to indicate to you that we also were able to get MIT Press to actually cards, right? Yeah, exactly. That it's not necessarily the material of the cardboard, as Leah was kind of pointing out to, and sort of the resistance of the paper, the weight of the paper, the color. Is it buff or ivory? Had long discussions about that too. But that certainly for, in terms of, Adam was kind of talking about this, the point is actually that there is a kind of unit that is coextensive with the card. So no matter what size you choose, the idea is that there is one idea, one piece of knowledge that is coextensive, and that it can be shuffled, right, rearranged to create sort of new narratives. So it's not necessarily, I think, about cardboard per se, but it is something about the section, the itemization, the sectioning off, the kind of coextensiveness, these units of knowledge that then can be mixed and matched and circulated and shared and so on.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I wanted to say something similar in that I think that you're right in that it's not necessarily the thickness, it's the idea that these are kind of loose leaf units. So the motion of reading is a different physical interaction with this. So we're not turning pages, we're kind of you know, flicking through things from also like from the top, which is interesting, and then sort of pulling them out. But with the index cards that we're producing, there is a sort of a thickness to them, but not necessarily because of the cards themselves, but because we're kind of sticking things on them and making things kind of interactive. So there's something very kind of haptic about these particular index cards, which Adam showed some origami that he's been putting on his, because his son Ezra is a kind of black belt in origami. So these things are assuming a really kind of interesting folded sort of topology.
But there is something specifically material, isn't there, about the difference between paper and cardboard? Some types of process can be encoded onto paper, like a piano can run off a roll. If it's spooling, it can run off a roll, but if it's shuffling, paper doesn't work. So it's the mainframes of the 50s use card because paper's not very good at that, but the pianolas or the Bletchley Park bombs can run paper because paper flows very nicely.
Squirrels, shall we say?
Yeah.
And also, I was going to add something about the slightness of the individual card. I mean, they accumulate into this Drude machine, which is interesting, and a larger catalogue, but on their own, isolated, in a kind of lonely form, individual cards, they can easily be lost, and that wouldn't be too bad. One can sort of take a risk with them, or be a bit speculative with them, or put something down on them that might lead somewhere but that might not. There's something there's something about latency that's really at the heart of the card. Like, this is not the finished thing. It's going to be put in a relationship with other cards that we don't quite understand or can't quite see yet. So that sense of them as a bit trivial, a bit everyday, I think a bit unlovely as material forms. And as things that could be lost and it wouldn't be too bad. I think there's something quite exciting and liberating about that, about all those qualities.
Yeah, I wondered in listening to you all talk about this, whether your projects weren't in some ways also resisting this idea of the sort of the ways in which the archive can seem so finite, you know, and particularly with the index cards, I thought you were going to use them as a sort of paper mache exercise, to sort of use them to build like Drude, you know. And Bonnie, I wondered as well about with your really wonderful analogy out, thinking about other biological mechanisms that transmission could be modeled on, whether you were thinking, I thought you were going in the direction of having the archive basically germinate, that you were thinking of having sort of seeds or something that, like the ones I have in my refrigerator that are, you know, need their sort of cold period in order to be able to come to life. So that's something that will be really interesting to hear you think about, you know, over the rest of your time with the project. And I hope we can have some sort of, you know, photographs that go up that document you letting go of your archive at the end. But I know there are a lot of questions, so and I will I think it might be easiest if I read them out. And so I'll start with Deirdre Lynch had the very first question, they're timestamped. So I'll start with you, Deirdre, and I hope you don't mind as I ventriloquize. But Deirdre says that she is very fascinated by this unfinishable project on an unfinished novel, and is reminded, I think because Gill wielded her scissors with such enthusiasm at the start of her remarks, of Roland Barthes' SC and what Barthes did to Balzac's novella Sarrasine, quoting, "We shall therefore start the text separating in the manner of a minor earthquake the blocks of signification. The Tudor signifier will be cut up into a series of brief contiguous fragments." And the resemblance makes me wonder what you all are learning about your reading habits, as well as what you're learning about presence. So I wondered what you as a group might have to say to that, about what the project has made you think about how you read, and when, and in what context your reading habits could be situated.
I've started reading a bit like, you know, when you do cryptic crosswords, that that sort of mode of reading where the words themselves become more like well, kind of different units, a different kind of matter. You see a good word and you think, that might make my friends laugh, I'm going to cut that out and stuff.
Yes.
So it's a much less kind of narrative, more kind of word-based way of reading.
It's whether things are usable.
Yeah.
But also the interesting thing about it is that I think that I'm trying to reread this book as I'm cutting out, so I'm kind of confronted by things like this. So I'm sort of making the book itself unreadable or semi-readable, or kind of readable in a sort of, you know, tree of codes sort of way, where I've created a different reading experience, which is full of holes.
I think maybe we ought to say that there is something that feels kind of thrilling about it. My head of department, John Mullen, wrote a book about Edwin Drude recently, and he just heard that I was cutting up a copy of it, and he was scandalized, and he well, maybe sort of facetiously scandalized, but I like that. I mean, there's something quite fun about your head of department being disappointed in you because you cut up his favorite book. So there is, there's a certain affect that that you can't deny.
And I suppose I'm conscious that I'm reading through the prism of the index card, that I'm reading looking for stuff that can be excised and inserted onto the index card, which means I'm looking for little pieces, not too big. I'm looking for parts and moments that are individually interesting, but that might also stand for a larger category, which can be added to and kind of produce a kind of group. I'm conscious of that all the time. And as I've gone on doing this, finding kind of, individual instances which also seem to stand for some larger category, which can be filled out. I'm also conscious that I make other kinds of notes as I'm reading, not to do with this project at all. So at the back of the copy I've got, I've just got my own notes, more traditionally in the inside back cover, which I should think more about this actually. They're not notes that really suit index card note taking, but they're things that I'm interested in. They're mostly bits that I like and I think are funny or moving or I want to come back to. And our index card system doesn't seem to be very good at catching that reading experience. And so for that, I have this different kind of register at the back. For a different kind of reading experience.
It's actually very interesting listening to you talk about this, because I mean, I don't have anything particularly to say personally about this, but it reminds me of the kind of commonplacing phenomenon in Renaissance Europe. Anne Blair talks about this. And I think Leah Price was even talking about paper slips. So Gessner, Leibniz has a little cabinet for his paper slips, where they're also, you know, they're interested in little excerpts, and they would read, and they would even cut out excerpts from books and put them in their cabinet so that, or collect them so that they could come back to it and reuse it later on. And that there were actually critics who said at the time, you know, learning has now become this kind of snippet kind of learning, and they were kind of despairing of, you know, traditional learning. And so it's very sort of interesting to hear sort of resonances of that here as well.
So, Leah Price has written a question that touches on a few, like, as could only be expected from Leah, touches on a few different aspects of what our panelists have discussed. And so I'll read this just to give you a sense of the question. So Leah starts by saying that Adam has emphasized the lightness of the index cards, but compared to the medium of books and printouts, index cards appear on the contrary to be quite heavy. They're made out of a stock that's heavier than ordinary paper, as is also the case for the boxes discussed by Bonnie. And so she asks whether the participants might be willing to think of themselves as theorists of cardboard. Is cardboard to logistics as paper is to text? And how does the weight of paper resist reduction of page scans to surface? And with this, I was really struck by Leah's, Leah reminded me of the role of lightness in this project, and particularly Bonnie, when you were talking about the different relationships of the codex to, say, the page box, the archival box, of whether you thought about the sort of textual density or the density of presence that might be associated with these. I know that's taking it in a slightly different direction away from the materiality of it. But I think that was also maybe where Leah was heading to. So I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
Well, you had mentioned very early on that, in fact, in the archival box, things often don't get their own enclosures, and that they're wrapped in a kind of tissue paper. And so that kind of distinction between the archival box, which is a cardboard, quite a heavy cardboard sorts, I think, and tissue paper that might wrap sort of items in there, I thought was quite interesting too, because then that made me think about, well, what kinds of things can you wrap in tissue paper? So not quite the form of the object, but like the form around the object. Because if you have a very heavy object, tissue paper actually is not a really good thing to wrap around it, because it'll just tear and shred. So I think in terms of lightness and weight, that's sort of one thing that I'd been thinking about. I'd also, as you know, been thinking about liquid as well, and the relationship between liquid, the archival box, and then also, again, this tissue of the in-between in the box as well. But how that will play out in this phase of in this version of my project, I'm not quite sure yet.
I just have one very practical thought in response to Leah's interesting question, which I need to go away and contemplate quietly for a while, I think, because there's a lot in there. That is, I haven't quite worked out a method for carrying around loose index cards on the move. My current mode is, first of all, my current method is to have about 8 or 9 with a rubber band around it in my pocket. But that's not quite working. They're tearing or bending or getting scruffy. So they seem actually practically not very helpful or suited to reading on the move. I guess the best system is to put them in the book as a kind of bookmark and use them in that particular kind of way. So I'm not quite sure if they're heavy or light or sturdy or fragile, or single things or or multiple. They seem to be kind of toggling between these states, but I'm quite interested in on a really deeply practical level of the best way for carrying cards around as a notation system.
Small Ziploc bag, I recommend. Also helps keep it out of the rain.
Yeah.
If you drop it in a puddle.
Yeah. Thank you.
You know, I was thinking in listening to this as well that Leah's question and your discussion reminded me of an archival item in the Natural History Museum. It's Joseph Banks. He uses a copy of Addison's edition of Paradise Lost to collect plant specimens that are dried. And I know you've all variously worked with this sort of intersection of the botanical or the collected object in the text. And so I wondered, along this vein, like whether you've given any thought to how paper acted differently in the archival side of your project than it might do in the essay or the codex, or if this idea of the lightness or the characteristics inherent in paper somehow changed or seemed different to you in your thinking about these two different aspects of the project.
Well, I just still really like Leah's observation that our project is based in card rather than paper. It hadn't really dawned on me, but this the pandemic has been the age of cardboard. I'm drowning in cardboard. Every day a man arrives at the door with more cardboard, and the idea that our project happened to choose cardboard as its substrate has really tickled me.
But I sort of agree with Adam that they're sort of cards, but only conceptually, because they're actually they are quite flimsy and fragile. So I'm thinking about like what the relationship between the index card and the paper slip, for example, and the page. Like what's the difference between those things? Is it about the thickness or the materiality of these things or how they feel, or is it just about what we do with them? You think that they're going to be more resistant, but actually I keep tearing them and bending them and losing them.
Yeah. So I'd like to actually take this question in a different direction. So less about sort of the cardboard and the thickness and light. It's sort of theorists of cardboard was the question. I mean, if stretched, I might actually say that for me anyway, theorist of information or knowledge, right? So again, it's sort of the idea that knowledge or information could be extracted and put on something like this and rearranged. So what are the dynamics that allow something that might be, embedded knowledge or sensation perception or something? What are the practices that then make it available to us like this? And what does that actually mean for us, for information, for knowledge production, or knowledge dissemination? Certainly, if I describe something and put it on this and mail it to you guys, then you can have it and see it, right? So there's a way in which this facilitates communication of information over distance, and that we can all refer to it, these kinds of things. So I think, my interest, at least in this particular category, is not about sort of the specifics of the material, although obviously I am interested in materiality, but also sort of the ways in which information or knowledge then changes depending on its material form. So as Adam was saying, the extraction of information to put it on this card is sort of an intermediary stage, because the idea is eventually you then write it up. This is how they used to use the cards, right? This was, you sort of collect all your bits, arrange them in the order you want, and then write it out in a ledger or a bound book. Once you figured out what the order is, we can look at the lovely article by Judith French card cataloging, where she talks about how playing cards, the backs of playing cards were blank in the 18th century, right? In fact, Catherine, Yale has a lovely collection of these. And so they would use the back of the playing cards to write descriptive notes to, arrange things in alphabetical order or whatever order before writing them out in a bibliography, in a ledger, in a codex that is bound. So, as Jill was saying, this is kind of the loose leaf version that precedes the kind of ledger bound version. And then, of course, at some point, people realized that having the loose leaf version, keeping the loose leaf version was actually useful because it could be used again for other reasons.
Thank you, that point. That's so interesting. That's so interesting to be, reminded of the index card as a point in a network of transmission. Like stuff happens before, there's text before, and it gets put onto an index card, and then conventionally the index card, that index card material is then written up or revised or narrativized or produces an article, and the index card, does it kind of fall away, or does it cease to matter at that point? But maybe what we're interested in is kind of stalling that process of the index card as a kind of bridge somewhere else, and thinking about the card itself.
Well, I think we're actually at time, so I will bring the discussion to a close, although there are really exciting questions pending on whether the participants in the 39-step press project all get to see the cards at different stages, and a question from Megan Heffernan more to you, Bonnie, on the aesthetics of the indexing, cataloging, archiving process as well. And so more yet to come to everyone who has joined us today. And I hope you'll join me in thanking our participants for a really exciting discussion.